Wall Street has caused tremendous problems for us. He claimed that he wasn't going to let Wall Street get away with murder. And he called out Goldman Sachs as the prime example of a big bank that has too much influence over the political process. That was really powerful stuff. But when candidate Trump became President Trump, he seemed to forget every scrap of his tough on Wall Street talk. Within weeks of taking office, he turned over his administration's economic agenda to none other than Goldman Sachs. His senior strategist, Steve Bannon, spent half a decade at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. His National Economic Council director, Gary Cohn, came directly from Goldman Sachs, where he spent 25 years and rose to become president of the bank. And his Secretary Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, spent 17 years at Goldman Sachs before leaving to start his own hedge fund. Which brings us to Jay Clayton, President Trump's nominee to run the Securities and Exchange Commission. To be fair, Mr. Clayton never worked at Goldman Sachs. He just worked for Goldman Sachs, taking their money and representing them for years as a lawyer at a major New York City law firm. So here we are, just over 8 years after Wall Street triggered a financial crisis and brought the economy to its knees, and President Trump has put the Goldman Sachs gang in charge of holding Wall Street accountable. Trump's betrayal of his campaign promises on Wall Street is shameful, but it is also dangerous, especially when it comes to picking the person to lead the SEC. The SEC is supposed to be the cop on the beat for Wall Street. That's why Congress created it in the 1930s after fraud and other misconduct on Wall Street led to an enormous stock market crash and the Great Depression. Congress gave the SEC the authority to oversee financial markets and to hold companies and individuals accountable when they defrauded investors. Now, when the SEC doesn't do its job, the consequences can be devastating. Look at what happened the last time the SEC was under Republican control in the years leading up to the 2008 crisis. The SEC was asleep at the switch. While Wall Street flooded the market with dangerous securities and lied to investors, the SEC heard nothing, saw nothing, stopped nothing. The Republican-led SEC did nothing, and when the whole market blew up, it was ordinary investors and working families who got asked to bail out Wall Street. So what kind of SEC chairman would Mr. Clayton be? Let's start by looking at how he would lead the SEC's enforcement efforts against Wall Street, how he would be as a cop on the beat. Under ethics rules, for the first half of his term, Mr. Clayton cannot participate in any enforcement action that involves one of his former clients. That means he cannot take part in any case against Goldman Sachs. Okay, but there's more. Goldman Sachs is just one of his former big bank clients. Mr. Clayton also can't take action against Deutsche Bank or against UBS or against Barclays. These are some of Wall Street's biggest and most egregious repeat offenders, and Mr. Clayton would be barred from enforcing the law against them. And that's not all. Ethics rules also prevent Mr. Clayton from participating in any enforcement case against a party that is represented by his former law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. Now, Sullivan and Cromwell is a premier Wall Street firm with a long client list that includes big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase and credit ratings agencies like Moody's. That means there'll likely be even more cases against top Wall Street firms that Mr. Clayton can't work on. Now, here's why that matters so much. For most enforcement actions, it takes a majority vote of the 5 SEC commissioners. In other words, it takes 3 people to advance an enforcement action. In a number of recent cases, the 2 Democrats have voted for stronger enforcement, and the 2 Republicans have voted against it. If the chairman can't vote, and Mr. Clayton can't vote if some of the biggest and most disreputable banks are involved, then the commission is likely to come up short of the necessary 3 votes. You know what that means? It means the banks walk free. Confirming Mr. Clayton to run the SEC will almost certainly result in weaker enforcement against the major players on Wall Street. Mr. Clayton is also likely to pursue a Wall Street-friendly agenda when it comes to the SEC's rulemaking responsibilities. When he testified before me and before other members of the Banking Committee, Mr. Clayton refused to commit to completing the rules that Congress asked the SEC to write all the way back in 2010 as part of its post-crisis financial reforms. Mr. Clayton even refused to commit to implementing and enforcing some of the post-crisis rules that the SEC has already finalized and put in place. I don't have any faith that Mr. Clayton will be the kind of tough, independent leader that we need at the SEC. His nomination is just one more broken promise, one more time that Donald Trump has put Wall Street ahead of the interests of the American people. The last time a Republican president led us down this path, it resulted in the worst financial crash of our lifetimes. We can't go down that path again. I will be voting against Mr. Clayton's nomination.